Welcome back to the Daily Dope. Um, so today we finally had Vermont become the ninth state to legalize marijuana and the first state to do it through, you know, the government making it happen. Celebrate for that. Now, one thing about this is that it just legalized marijuana. It just took the penalties off of marijuana and marijuana growing a little bit. I'll go ahead and read this HuffPost article here. Vermont makes history by legalizing marijuana, but its law comes with a catch. No sales. For the first time, the U.S. has legalized marijuana with the stroke of a pen, not a vote at the ballot box. Vermont Governor Phil Scott, Republican, on Monday signed into law House Bill 511, which legalizes the possession of up to 1 ounce of cannabis and removes penalties for possession of up to 2 mature plants and up to 4 immature plants. The legislation says nothing about creating a state market for recreational weed. However, the new law will go into effect in July. It seems like a decriminalization situation, and why would they have to wait till July for that? It doesn't make any sense. All this don't make sense. It sounds like the police are heavily involved in making sure they still get to do some shit before they actually legalize and decriminalize marijuana. I mean, let's face it, 2 plants, 6 plants, I don't know. Today, with mixed emotions, I have signed 511, said Scott in a statement addressed to the state's General Assembly. By the way, he did this in private. There wasn't a big ceremony with the giving the ink pen to maybe the Marijuana Policy Project or somebody that's heavily involved in these behind the scenes legalization efforts. Anyway, he said, I personally believe that what adults do behind closed doors and on private property is their choice, so long as it does not negatively impact the health and safety of others, especially children. With Scott's signature, Vermont will join 8 other legal weed states as well as Washington, D.C., in a growing movement away from federal law, which still classifies marijuana as a Schedule I substance alongside heroin and LSD. Vermont legalized medical marijuana in 2004 and is currently among nearly 30 states, plus the territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia with such programs in place. Although other states have legalized cannabis through ballot initiatives that have left the decision up to voters, Vermont does not allow for such a process. Over the past few years, lawmakers in the state have instead been working to address marijuana reform through legislation. A similar legalization bill made it to Scott's desk in 2017, but the governor vetoed it, citing concerns with weak language on punishment for the sale of marijuana to minors and its establishment of a commission to study how regulated cannabis markets would work in Vermont. The first version of H511 clarified civil penalties for the sale of marijuana to individuals under 21 years of old and removed the commission entirely. Scott has instead created his own marijuana task force, which is examining the state's involvement in recreational cannabis sales and focusing on developing comprehensive education, prevention, and highway safety strategies. Quote, there must be comprehensive and convincing plans completed in these areas before I will begin to consider the wisdom of implementing a commercial tax and regulate system for an adult marijuana market, Scott said on Monday. It is important for the General Assembly to know that. Until we have a workable plan to address each of these concerns, I will veto any additional effort along these lines which manages to reach my desk. So we're back to the reefer madness stuff again. You're worrying about people selling to minors. Well, the black market don't care, so continue to have a black market, and I'm sure minors will continue to get their hands on marijuana, no problem. Furthermore, this whole driving thing where you're talking about prevention and highway safety strategies. The safety strategies on the highway are already there. You don't have to invent new strategies for your highway safety. Unless you're talking about just pulling people over randomly and seeing if they're stoned, and then if they are, locking them up for no fucking reason because they were driving perfectly fine. So all this bantering about, oh, I'll sign it or I'll veto it, this is just him still acting like he's kicking and screaming. All right. So meanwhile, while he's kicking and screaming, the state itself is the big loser in this because they could be, getting their little cut on every sale. Why is it that the Democrats aren't like embracing cannabis as an issue, but when it comes down to sales, they embrace that? They're like all about making that money for the government. Like I don't understand why Republicans. I mean, it just doesn't make much sense. So some state officials say the composition on that commission looks to be biased against marijuana, which means recreational weed faces an uncertain future in Vermont. Quote, there is frustration that the governor's panels appear to be predetermined in opposition to tax and regulate model for marijuana sales versus the sentiment of the House and Senate, which is to move forward, said Lieutenant Vermont Governor David Zuckerman, who is a Democrat. The governor's commission is expected to deliver a final report to lawmakers by the end of the year, which would guide them on future legislation to establish a market for cannabis. Under Vermont's two-step process of legalization, it could be a while before the state sees its first legal marijuana sales, says Matt Simon, the New England political director for the Marijuana Policy Project, a nonprofit organization that advocates for the cannabis reform around the country. And again, like I was saying about just about everywhere, and it feels like in Michigan where I live, is a lot of Republicans feel that they're vulnerable to support any kind of marijuana legislation, even though the support is there for half the country and over 50% of Republicans. If you break that down, they still feel like their people that they represent aren't there yet, which is ridiculous. And then it just kind of tells you about how much money, they're missing out on by not taxing and regulating. So then they make a good point here. Without a tax and regulate system in Vermont, all commerce involving cannabis would remain underground. Quote, marijuana is widely available, widely used throughout Vermont. Vermonters spend an awful lot of money on marijuana, and it all goes to the illicit market, said Simon. Why wouldn't we have a regulated system so that the money would instead go to tax and regulated businesses, and the state would have some revenue to deal with any cost issues that do arise? Because you always hear about these cops and other entities talking about how they're going to need more money when legalization happens. Don't understand why, but so despite the Justice Department's actions on the Cole memo and the whatever fallout comes from that, and the political stigma around marijuana reform still hasn't faded completely, said Zuckerman, who is, remember, he's the lieutenant governor. But he hopes the Vermont legislators' successful move towards legalization could serve as an invitation for lawmakers in other states to pursue reform. That this is a significant signal to other legislative bodies around the country that legislators can act in the interests of the general population without some of the fear that there will be electoral retribution, he said. In the world of making laws, that is often one of the things that lawmakers look at, the potential consequence. And that's unfortunate. We're always living from election to election cycle, and, politicians are cowering to, the voters, so they basically try to stay out of hot button issues so that when it comes time for election time, there isn't that memory in the voters' heads about whether they were for or against a position that is one of those hot button issues, just like this issue obviously is. And if you're a Republican, I guess you still feel like most of the constituents are gonna vote against you if you support it, and that's kind of ridiculous. But back to the other point that he made, yeah, legislative bodies around the country, and especially on the East Coast, you have Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland. All these places have people in their legislative bodies that have floated ideas of legalizing adult use cannabis, taxing and regulating it. Connecticut had basically the same kind of blueprint as Vermont. New Jersey wants to go for a full-blown, tax and regulate system. And basically, DC already has what Vermont's doing. So what is the deal? Is the dominoes going to start falling or what? We already know that the governor that just got elected in New Jersey is pro-legalization. And as far as like Massachusetts goes, or Massachusetts is, again, they're already legalized and they have a regulated system. Maine legalized, but governor there decided he didn't like the regulation package, so he vetoed it, and they're still floating in some kind of a purgatory where it's legal to grow a certain amount of plants, it's legal to possess a certain amount of cannabis, but no regulated or tax system. So it seems like the Republican led things, and DC's not really led by Republicans, I don't think. It's usually a Democrat mayor. But anyway, DC doesn't get to make their own rules, in case you didn't know that. DC's laws are basically made, and the whole governing system of DC is done by Congress. So, yeah. Anyway, all that aside, Vermont, 9th state to legalize marijuana. First state to do it through the legislature. I'm not a big fan of legislative actions to legalize marijuana because it's usually corrupt and a bunch of bullshit going on. I don't think Vermont's like that. Obviously, they don't have a tax and regulated system even drawn up, so we can't really judge it. But from what I understand, the people that are involved in the process want to spread the money out thinly to many instead of thickly to few. So hopefully that's the way they go. And that's all I got on this. Hit the subscribe button on your way out. Peace.